Hello, welcome to the last, but not the least, event in CJEB's annual conference, which we've sadly been unable to hold in person since 2019. We're so grateful to all of you who have dialed in today, and we hope we'll see you in person in Tokyo next year. I'm particularly grateful to all the faithful participants in the project on Japanese corporate governance and stewardship events. I'm Alicia Ogawa, the project director of the series. I always open each event with a bit of a mission statement, which is to say that the objective of our studies and discussions is to compare the best practices of Japan and the US in hopes of provoking new ideas on how to improve each of our governance systems. Japan often looks to the US for answers on many of its issues, but I believe that there are also important things that the US can learn from Japan when it comes to governance. Corporate governance systems are under extreme stress, both in the US and in Japan, for many of the same reasons. First, there's been a flurry of corporate scandals. Second, companies and their boards of directors are faced with a multitude of daunting new geopolitical challenges. These include cybersecurity threats, supply chain disruptions due to COVID, financial sanctions on Russia, new restrictions based on national economic security concerns, and business disruptions due to national disasters. Finally, we are possibly in a shift to a global economy where, for the first time in decades, inflation becomes an issue with which boards must cope. And on top of that, investors are making new demands of companies and their boards on a host of ESG issues. These include extremely complex issues relating to diversity, social justice, workers' rights, tax payments, lobbying and political contributions, biodiversity, and of course, environmental and climate change issues. Investors have been clamoring for experts in these issues to be elected as independent board directors. Perhaps the most famous recent case is the activist fund Engine No. 1's success in electing 3 directors to the board of Exxon, who are expected to help Exxon develop a more robust strategy in the transition to clean energy. At first glance, some of these issues would seem to have little relevance in Japan. However, several global Japanese companies have found themselves in the middle of controversy on one or more of these issues. Gun control might seem to be a very US-specific issue, and yet there's at least one Japanese retailer in the US which has declined to disclose a policy on sales of ammunition and is being targeted by consumers for its failure to do so. To cite another example, one of the major Japanese automakers is facing consumer protests when it was disclosed that the company had made substantial campaign contributions to members of Congress who were involved in the January 2021 insurrection in Washington, D.C. And we all know of Japanese companies who have come under negative focus for their operations in Myanmar or for buying materials produced in forced labor camps in China. So while the tsunami of new demands on the board is occurring in both Japan and the US, the history, traditions, laws, and regulations of the two countries are of course quite different. These differences are reflected in the different concepts of the role of the independent director. With apologies to Professor Gordon for being overly simplistic, American independent directors function as the monitors of the internal executives. Their job is to continuously check the systems in place and to make sure that nothing is going wrong. By contrast, the role of Japanese independent directors is more of an advisory role. They are expected to contribute to strategy and to act as partners to the internal executives and to help achieve the goals that are set by the board. The American model is under duress as US companies become more and more global and more complex. As Professor Gordon makes clear, American independent directors who are part-time, who have limited information about the companies, and who are not provided with strong financial incentives to commit themselves fully, are not truly equipped to do such a difficult job. Of course, in both countries, independent directors are supposed to represent the interests of the shareholder. And here's where the two systems begin to diverge completely. In the US, for some time now, the interests of shareholders have been regarded as quite separate from those of stakeholders. That attitude is under fierce attack, and things are changing. For example, in 2010, only 20 S&P 500 companies had a person in the role of Chief Sustainability Officer. By 2020, that number had grown to 95. By contrast, in the case of Japan, stakeholders have long reigned supreme. A Métis survey taken 10 years ago showed that Japanese CEOs regard employees as their top priority, followed by customers and suppliers. Shareholders ranked in 6th place. The truth is that in the history of Japanese capital markets, shareholders are not the same as investors. The role of Japanese shareholders historically was not to earn a return on their investment, but to provide stability for the management of companies whose share they held, and by extension, stability for the society, including the employees. This is not a criticism, and in fact, we in America have our own mechanism to protect management. It's called dual class shares, which give company founders an unassailable majority voting power at shareholder meetings. But this raises several questions. Who do independent directors in Japan represent? What is expected of them? And what support can they expect from traditional shareholders who often outnumber real investors? Two of our speakers today, Hamaguchi-san and Ichikawa-san, are experts on this issue, cross-shareholding or allegiance shareholding. The official numbers on cross-shareholding show a declining trend, but the fact is that allegiance shareholding is as persistent as ever in many corporate sectors. And let's not forget that there is no legal definition or accounting definition of cross-shareholding. It is up to each company to define how they classify their equity investments. I share Hamaguchi-san's view that the combination of cross-shareholding and a rigid labor market greatly limits the ability of independent directors to help Japanese companies to grow globally, to innovate, and to improve their operations. But I'm keen to hear from our panelists who actually do this job. In conclusion, Board 3.0 is a powerful prescription to solve the weaknesses of the American board structure. Perhaps there are elements of Professor Gordon's Board 3.0 concept that could be integrated into the Japanese governance in a way that would support and empower the board. I have some ideas to suggest. And as the model assumes a close connection between management and knowledgeable investors, it could serve to bring some much needed market discipline to Japanese companies in general. So let's begin the debate. I am thrilled that we have with us here the man himself, Professor Jeff Gordon of Columbia Law School, who will give us a summary of his concept and how it might relate to Japan. Professor Christina Ahmadjian, Mr. Hamaguchi, and Ms. Ichikawa will then deliver some of their own views about the role of independent directors based on their own experiences and observations. Professor Ahmadjian is an academic specialist on business organization and has served on numerous Japanese corporate boards. Mr. Hamaguchi was formerly the CIO of the Pension Fund Association, an organization long regarded as a champion of corporate governance in Japan. He now sits on the board of Licksil. Finally, Ms. Ichikawa is a lawyer who is a co-founder of the Board Director Training Institute in Tokyo, and she sits on the boards of two major Japanese companies. We'll engage in a group debate after their statements, and we'll be delighted to take questions from the audience at any point in the debate, so please type these in the Q&A box. It now just remains for me to invite Professor Gordon to start us off. Please take it away, Professor Gordon.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be presenting in this event and as part of the great series that this Columbia Center on Japan has put together. And I really appreciate the attention that an article that was co-authored with my friend and colleague, Ron Gilson, Board 3.0, has received attention in Japan. Ronald's first article about corporate governance in Japan was written 30 years ago. So we both are longtime observers of the Japanese environment. There are two distinct themes in our work that I would like to highlight today. First is a claim about how governance institutions change over time. This is an evolutionary story, adaptation in response to selection pressures. The second is a discussion about a specific governance innovation that has been in the United States most fully developed for portfolio companies of private equity firms that may have carryover application for the public firm. This is Board 3.0, and the idea of independent directors who are thickly informed, well-resourced, and highly motivated to create value. So the first theme of our work is really an evolutionary claim that specific governance features such as the board are shaped by real-world business issues that governance can help resolve. But that over time, these governance institutions become entrenched, even though they become less well-suited to the business need of the enterprise. That under selection pressure, these governance institutions can change, evolve, and fashion significant modifications that better suit the new business and economic environment. We tell this story in the United States in terms of three models for boards of directors: Boards 1.0, Board 2.0, and Board 3.0. The sequence is this. The board model is established as a functional adaptation to the current business needs. The board model becomes entrenched, meaning even though the environment may change, the board retains its prior form. And third, there is a deteriorating fit between the entrenched board model and the current environment, reflected in a series of crises that can open the way to innovation and even thoroughgoing change. So Board 1.0, commonly called the advisory board model, mixes the insiders, this is in the United States, mixes the insiders, elite financiers, elite businessmen, and others. And it arose in the early 20th century in the United States to solve the managerial and financial issues of building large-scale enterprise of national scope. So therefore, for Board 1.0, you had the insiders that reflected the diverse business units that needed to be integrated, sort of mashed together. Then the elite financiers who provided the reputation that provided outside investors with security about the reliability of the firm's financial results. And then finally, directors who were commonly senior officers or directors at other firms who could bring their specialized knowledge to bear. But as markets developed, the growth, and you had a growth in the size of the professional management group and a hierarchy within the firm, the Board 1.0 model lost its strongly functional drivers and instead basically served as a moat that protected the imperial CEO from challenge. So a series of scandals in the United States in the 1970s triggered really the evolution into Board 2.0, which is the monitoring board model, consisting almost exclusively of independent directors who are responsible for overseeing the economic performance of the firm, but also overseeing the firm's compliance with the mandate for financial disclosure and other legal requirements of the firm. The point is that the Board 2.0 model is staffed by part-time directors who we claim are underinformed and under-resourced and motivated. This leads to a challenge because of the deteriorating fit between this model and the current environment. First, the complexity of the large firm. The part-timers simply won't have the time or the expertise to engage with the oversight that they're supposed to do in a meaningful way. Second, in the United States is the increased power that the shareholders have to challenge management's own plans for the firm. The way the hedge funds can bring together the institutional owners who are the majority owners to challenge management's plans for the firm. And because of the limited capacity of the Board 2.0 directors, basically the shareholders who make these decisions feel that they're unable to rely on those directors in trying to resolve the issues between the management on the one hand and the activists on the other. So we describe this as, on the one hand, there's market myopia that's commonly claimed on the part of the activist investors, but there's, on the other hand, the hyperopia of the management team, always thinking that things in the future are going to resolve in their favor. So in short, the key issues of Board 2.0, it can't deal with the increased size and complexity of the large firm because the directors are part-time and they don't have staff, they really aren't resourced in the right way to perform the oversight that's being called for them. And third, because they're part-timers, their motivations are quite constrained. Basically, they really want to avoid embarrassment, which undercuts their willingness to take risk about the firm and engage with the elements of a dynamic business environment. So, and this in turn, of course, gives the activists space to challenge the management team. All right, so this has led us to look for an alternative board model. Here we turn to the private equity governance model based on a number of interviews at PE firms. We sketch out a board model that is commonly used in the governance of the portfolio companies of the private equity investors. The characteristics, although they vary, of course, a small board, folks who have an economic stake in how well the firm is doing, intense engagement with the management team, deep knowledge about the firm, and a capacity to analyze in a separate way, perhaps the claims that management takes about the strategy of the firm. Now, the directors, the PE directors, are not senior in the sense that they're not at the end of their career and perhaps see their work as directors as challenging the work they might be doing on their golf game. Rather, they are going to make their career as successful directors of these new firms. So they have in addition to the financial elements of their incentives, they also have a career goal of trying to show that they can do a good job of creating and overseeing the value creation at these firms. So what we imagine are empowered directors who can marshal the full analytic capacity of the PE firm to assess the strategy of the firm and the operational decisions that the CEO is called upon to make. So in short, the core elements here are directors who are thickly informed, well-resourced, and highly motivated. Now, the value of the PE governance model the demonstration is the consistency with which the best PE firms are able to generate gains, the productivity gains that they're able to show, the financial gains that they're able to show. In the early part of the PE cycle, many of the gains were financial engineering, but not today. The gains come from the strategy and from the operational success. So now how might the PE model apply to the public firm in the United States? What would Board 3.0 look like? How do we take the lessons of a new model and apply it to a big firm? So a Board 3.0, in our view, is a board that has a mix of directors on the current Board 2.0 model and empowered directors, 3.0 directors, who would be charged specifically with oversight of the strategy and the operational performance of the management team. The 2.0 directors would serve as they now do on compliance focus committees and would perhaps take on special committees as required. The Board 3.0 directors would serve on an extra committee, the Strategy Review Committee. And these directors would be supported by an internal strategic analysis office that would provide the backup support for a 3.0 directors engagement with the management team. If additional support is required, the 3.0 directors could engage an outside consultant. The 3.0 directors, and this is important, would receive long-term stock-based compensation. The compensation expectation of a similar PE director would be a useful guide to the expected level for a 3.0 director. This is an important point here. The 3.0 director would be a mid-career professional, and the additional compensation would come from developing a reputation for helping to create value at the firm. So there would be repeat play in effect as part of the model. A director could obtain a reputation for doing a great job at one firm. There would be a limit on the term that that director could serve to minimize the risk that he or she is captured by the management team, and to reinforce the extent to which the career success of the 3.0 director depends upon being able to deliver results for this firm and perhaps for other firms. So to come back to the sort of the theoretical framework within which this sets is evolution. Sometimes a board model, even if it started as a great fit to the environment, loses that fit. The board model needs to change. Board 3.0 offers a model of an empowered director who may be able to push the firm to superior performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gordon. Now that we've had that explanation from Professor Gordon about what the vision of Board 3.0 is, I want to invite each of our panelists to talk about their own experiences as independent directors on Japanese companies and what, if any, relevance they see for Board 3.0 in Japan, well, and how the current model in Japan is working. So I'm going to ask Professor Ahmadjian to start off, and then we'll move on to Mr. Hamaguchi. Professor Ahmadjian, can you start us off?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and I very much enjoyed and intrigued by Professor Gordon's introduction of the Board 3.0 model. And I completely agree with this notion that the model of the board very much has to evolve with the times. It has to evolve with the local conditions, the issues, the problems. Completely agree with that. I have a little bit of a question of this the basic fundamental private equity view of this, and is this really applicable to Japan or not? But I think this idea that boards need to evolve is critical. And the key question in Japan is, do Japanese boards, do we need a completely new model, or do we need to just do better on our own model? So I want to say a few words about my experience on Japanese boards. I've been studying Japanese corporate governance since about 1990 when I was teaching at Columbia, and have served on boards of Japanese companies since 2008 or so. And governance in Japanese companies has really improved. And it's hard to say exactly, this is better, this is better, this is better. So instead of saying how much has it improved, to show you numbers, show you facts and figures, let me talk a little bit about my experience on Japanese boards. And I want to have a few things to say. One is that, okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the topics that my boards have covered over the last 6 months or so. And these are not topics that have just been cruised through, but topics that have been really discussed in board meetings. And they include issues including long-term vision, long-term strategy, how it relates to the famous or infamous midterm plan that Japanese companies have. We've talked about milestones, about specific KPIs. There's been a lot of talk about ESG issues, particularly carbon zero issues, and recently human rights issues as well. Talk about the supply chain crisis these days. There's been a lot of talk about listed subsidiaries and a lot of debate about that. Dividend policy, investor feedback and how we should respond to it comes up pretty frequently. R&D, innovation, organic growth versus acquisition all comes up. How do we measure the results of R&D? Issues on business portfolio, conglomerate discount is a big deal in several of my board companies. Global governance for the very global firms. There's increased attention to cash flow, the balance sheet. The 8% ROE or else obsession for better or worse is over. There's less talk about that, at least in my boards. Lots of talk about succession planning, CEO compensation, stock versus cash pay time horizon. I think those are pretty much the right issues. And I feel on my board, there's considerable freedom for independent external directors to bring up issues. There's lots of opportunity to discuss. How do I spend my time and on boards? And of course, there are the board meetings, but increasingly there are outside meetings, kondankai, say in Japan, special meetings where we do deep dives into pretty big issues. Lots of talk about diversity, strategy, lots of meetings. And I think this may be a fad in Japan, but I think it's very healthy with young employees around the globe on Zoom, with future candidates for CEO, with women who we want to promote. There's lots of conversation and interaction with people at all levels, at least on my boards. Now that COVID is hopefully ending or the situation's getting better, I hope that we're going to be returning to more site visits, factory visits. There's a lot. I find that we spend quite a bit of time interacting with the company. Surprisingly though, and I can't really figure this out, is that despite all the talk of engagement with investors, there's remarkably little time spent with investors talking face to face with them. I don't know if that's just me or everyone. Okay, what my evaluation of Japanese boards, what's good? And I'm not going to talk about monitoring board or advisory board, but what do I think has been effective? One is that the board brings attention to issues that companies, the Japanese management have not paid attention to or haven't paid enough attention to. Something like you're a global company, you need to have a global governance system, which sounds obvious, but is a very, very big deal. Issues like diversity isn't just putting a bunch of women and giving them titles, you have to really make it work. Again, those are very valuable issues and may not sound as glorious as strategy, but they're an important component in supporting strategy. I also find that boards are very critical as an excuse, that CEOs can use the board as an excuse to do really difficult things, like closing factories, like laying off people when necessary. I think that's a really valuable function of the board. And I also think boards have an important role in improving the quality of management by monitoring the management, making sure the management makes targets and hits their targets, that they're doing what they say they do. What needs work? And I want to highlight a couple areas that I think are the issues for Japanese companies right now. One is an issue of strategy, but the issue I think is much more around the strategic planning process, that there's still an obsession with the 3-year, usually time horizon plan that you spend tons of time making it. These days, I think companies are more serious about hitting their targets, but it's the plan, and there's a bit too much of worship of the plan. And I think this issue of long-term versus short-term versus mid-term strategy and the planning process is critical. One. Issue number 2 is board composition. And despite all this talk about the skills matrix, which again is kind of this strange object of worship that I don't think has been implemented terribly effectively yet. But you see boards of Japanese companies and they're elderly Japanese men, elderly Japanese women, elderly token foreign women and men, maybe, but it's old people who really see old Japan, and they often make their decisions and give their advice from a very traditionally Japanese perspective. And there's a desperate need for age diversity, for global diversity, global experience diversity, industry diversity. And I think that's one connecting point with Professor Gordon's board 3.0 issues. So I think that's a big, big deal. So I think Japanese boards have achieved a lot, have made a lot of progress, but still have some outstanding issues. Can they be solved by, or should they be solved by a completely new model? Or should they be solved by making board 2.0, or maybe we're still in board 1.0, by strengthening the current structure? I think that's an important issue, and I look forward to debating this with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmadjian. I just want to ask quickly, one of our mutual friends who has served on many, many, many boards has said to me that the biggest change for him has been that over the past several years, or certainly since the introduction of the corporate governance code, that the discussion of shareholder returns, of dividend payout and share buybacks is now a routine thing that gets discussed at the board. And his remark is that that's a big change. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's much more time being spent. Yeah.
Great.
Is it enough? Is it enough?
Well, I mean, on the share buybacks, I think it's worth noting that companies buy back their shares but don't cancel them. And in a bizarre way, some of the companies who buy back their shares end up being their own biggest shareholders, right? But let's move on now to Mr. Hamaguchi, who, as I mentioned, has a very distinguished past as CIO of Pension Fund Association, of a real sort of leader in corporate governance in Japan, and he's now on the board of Rikkyo. So can I invite you to step up to the Zoom mic, Mr. Hamaguchi?
まず、経営戦略の議論を深掘りするにはですね、ボード 2.0 では限界があると いうのは、私もその通りではないかと思います。やはり社外取締役の情報不足、リソース不足、インセンティブ不足が問題になるのではとは思います。それではどうすればいいのか、必ずしも明暗はありませんが、社外取締役としてはですね、経営陣がこの経営戦略の問題についても株主の声もきちんと聞いてやっておりですね、それが業績と株価に反映されていくことを確認していく。もしダメなら指名委員会の権限で CEO を変えるというようなことに尽きるのではないかと思います。つまりマーケットと社外取締役双方で経営陣に圧力をかけ続けるということだと思います。ところで、ボード 3.0 はプライベートエクイティのボードを参考にしたということですが、このプライベートエクイティの高いリターンはですね、そもそも戦略執行が優れていることが主な要因なのかという疑問を私は持っています。一般論としてはですね、戦略の中身が優れていること自体よりもですね、一定の戦略を一貫して遂行できることがより大きく寄与しているのではないかというふうに思っています。そしてそれは、PE ファンドがですね、支配株主であったり、その他の株主が限定されていてですね、意思決定が容易で、かつ上場企業のようにですね、株価とか情報開示義務に影響されないことがで、そういう一貫した戦略が取れるということになっているのではないかと思っています。それではその同様の効果をですね、上場企業がボード 3.0 で実現できるのかという問題ですが、一部のケースでは可能かもしれませんが、一般論としてはなかなか容易ではないという気がします。まずボード 3.0 の、特定の投資家と関係する、戦略を担当する役員の選任についてですね、多様な投資家、上場企業ですから多様な投資家の賛同を長期間一貫して維持できるのかと、特に逆風にさらされた時にも大丈夫かという問題があると思います。上場公開企業の投資家の意見は様々で、投資の目的もそれぞれ異なるかもしれません。また、上場企業の情報開示規制などが障害になるかもというところも気になっております。結論としてですね、米国のようにボードガバナンス以前にですね、市場機能自体によるガバナンス、これを私はマーケットガバナンスと呼んでいますが、これが有効に効いている環境の中ではですね、ボードガバナンスの選択肢の一つとして有効なのかもしれないとは思います。しかし、日本のようにですね、後ほど述べる安定株主の存在で、マーケットガバナンスが有効に効いていない環境の中では、そもそもボード 3.0 の対象候補になるような会社は極めて限られているのではないかと思います。例えば、そのような、ある意味で非常にドラスティックな体制をとってまでですね、変革が必要な会社というのは多分ですね、安定株主に守られた保守的な経営陣のところが多くて、そもそもそのような提案はですね、最初から拒否されるでしょうし、議論の訴状にも上らないのではないかと思います。したがって、日本のボード全般の改革の選択肢として議論するのは少々無理があってですね、それならもっと他に議論すべき重要な問題があるのではというふうに思っています。誤解を避けるために一言を付け加えますと、一般のいわゆる投資家経験者をもっと社外取締役としてですね、起用すること、これは大賛成です。 日本ではまだ例が少ないのですが、もっともっと増えるべきだと思っています。ただ、ボード 3.0 の議論は、特定の投資家と関係するその人をですね、そのまま起用するという話ですので、それは少し性格の異なるテーマでですね、慎重に議論すべき点が多いのではというふうに考えています。それでは先ほど申し上げた日本について議論すべき重要な問題とは何かといえばですね、それはやはり安定株主体制のことになると私は思っています。その前に日本のガバナンス改革の現状について少し触れさせていただきます。結論から申し上げますと、先ほど言ったマーケットガバナンス、すなわち株式市場自体の機能の改善についての施策がですね、不徹底なままで、企業内部のボードガバナンスについての議論をですね、正直あまりにも細かく進めているのでですね、かつそれが官主導で進められている結果ですね、むしろ弊害の方が多くなってきているのではないかという感じを持っています。これは誤解がないように付け加えますと、平均的な話でして、もちろん良い方に改善する例はいくつもあると思いますが、平均的にはですね、形式から実質へという謳い文句とは裏腹にですね、形式主義がはびこりつつあり、逆にガバナンスの劣化が始まっているのではないかというふうに危惧しています。誤解を恐れずに、あえて言えばですね、コーポレートガバナンスコードで、求められているからと、まだ5年とか6年、7年ぐらいですよね。社外取締役が急増しているということもですね、この形式主義の表れではないかというふうに心配しています。現状が実質的でないとすれば、それは切実な必要性がないからで、必要性がないというのは、つまりマーケットガバナンスが効いていないからではないでしょうか。株価が長期間低迷していても、どうしても何とかする必要はなくてですね、株主総会で否決される危険もないので、どうしても何とかする必要もない、そんなマーケットではないでしょうか。マーケットガバナンスが効かない最大の原因は、いまだに変わらない安定株主構造があるからだと思います。その要因の一つである、いわゆる持ち合い、政策保有株式については、個別のケースでは解消が進んでいるような報道もされていますが、解消のスピードが極めて遅く、相変わらず高い安定株主比率に象徴されているように、全体像は、あまりほとんど変わっていないのではないでしょうか。今日は特にデータをお見せしませんが、必要なら専門誌で商事ホームというものがありまして、そこで毎年実施している安定株主比率のアンケート調査というものがございますので、そちらを参照してください。政府も経済界も証券業界もこの問題に本気で取り組んでいるようには見えません。さらに、ここ数年ですね、日銀および国の年金である GPIF という巨大なかつパッシブな公的資金によるですね、市場のいわば河川化が進んだことによって、むしろ問題は実質的に悪化している可能性があるのではというふうに考えています。安定株主構造の下では株価低迷によるですね、買収の脅威がないので、いまだに PBR1 倍割れが多い状態が続いており、もうこの問題はもう何十年も議論されてますけども、いまだに続いており、これは株式市場の価格機能がワークしてないということだと思います。安定株主の賛成票が 引き続き多数を占めるケースが多いのでですね、一般株主の議決権交渉を通じた統治機能も十分に働いているとは言えないと思います。この両機能がワークしていない中でですね、コーポレートガバナンスの形式主義がはびこれば、これは文字通り砂上の楼閣でありですね、危険な状態だと思います。では、なぜこの安定株主体制の改革が進まないのかということですが、中にはですね、単に経営陣の保身のためというものもあるでしょうが、もう一つの背景としてはですね、労働市場の改革がなかなか進まない問題があるからだと思います。さらにその背後にはですね、安定した雇用の場を提供する共同体としての会社の存在を重視する、そういう日本の、我々はそれ縦社会と呼んでますけども、縦社会もしくは単一社会の構造があるからです。またその中で育まれてきたですね、安定、安心、安全を重視する、あえて言いますと、少し過度に重視するですね、日本の文化も影響していると考えています。象徴的にはですね、例えば会社を売ることは、米国では経営者の成功の証になるでしょうが、日本では経営者の恥になります。また、社会的な制裁を受ける恐れもあるのではないでしょうか。そういう社会構造ですので、その下でですね、現在、日本の会社が選択と変化、そして改革を求められている、そういう経済情勢であると思いますが、日本の株式市場はですね、その中で果たせる役割は、残念ながらおのずと限界があるという感じもしています。これは悲観論に聞こえるでしょうが、日本の安定、安心、安全がですね、いまだに守られているのはですね、この国民の価値観に基づくですね、肯定的で重要な事実であるということも我々は認識しておく必要があると思います。ただし一方で、現状を続ける限り、ずっと永遠にですね、この安定安心安全が保てるわけではなく、いずれ破綻する時が来ると私は残念ながら思っています。それを避けるためにですね、何をすべきなのか、社会構造まで含めてですね、どう変えていくのか、どうすれば株式市場が機能するようになりですね、会社と経済が発展、回復していくのか、その解を見つけて実行していくのが日本の今後の最大の課題だというふうに私は思っています。以上です。
Thank you very much, Hamaguchi-san. I hope we have time to come back to this point. We can talk about cross-shareholdings forever, but I think you make a very important point that in Japan, different from America, corporate governance has been led by the government, not by the market. And Hamaguchi-san made an interesting comment to me. He said, if we look at the UK corporate governance code, it's a couple of pages long. The last version of the Japanese corporate governance code, at least in English, was sort of 37 pages long. And while many people criticize Japanese companies for so-called ticking the box on governance, the fact of the matter is that the government has given them a lot of boxes to tick. So let's come back to that if we have time, but I'd like to give Ms. Ichikawa a chance to share with us her experiences and her points of view about all of these difficult issues.
おはようございます。市川幸子と申します。本日はパネリストとして参加できまして大変光栄です。ありがとうございます。私は弁護士をしておりまして、会社役員育成機構のメンバーの一人であります。BDTI と言います。BDTI が2009年に設立されたんですけれども、それからずっと日本のコーポレートガバナンスの進展を見てまいりました。ガバナンスコードの効果と限界、 ボード 3.0 の議論の盛り上がりについて、今日は試験を述べたいと思います。まずはスライドをご覧いただきたいと思います。スライドシェアをお願いします。これは BDTI の GoTo データから抽出してきたものなんですが、独立役員が増えました。女性役員も増えています。それをはるかに上回るスピードで指名委員会と報酬委員会が増えています。ガバナンスを効かせるための形式的な要件は整いつつあると言っていいと思います。では次のページを見てください。ただ、ROE、ROA、ROIC はあまり高くなっていません。緑色になるほど良い数字なんですけれども、見ていただくと分かる通り、指名委員会があっても緑色にならないんですね。独立取締役が半数以上いても薄緑色にしかなっていません。緑色になるのは社歴が45年未満の若い会社であります。また、ハーフィンダールインデックスが高い会社です。上から2行目ですね。つまり、大株主に株式が集中しているような会社です。もう1枚スライドを見てみましょう。政策保有株式は減少しています。ところが、ペースは遅いですし、直近では逆行も見られます。買収防衛策の導入事例も減ってはいます。ただ、最近の裁判例には注意を要するものがあります。この減少の傾向に変化を呼ぶかもしれないなというふうに考えています。自己株式の保有割合が増えています。株主還元としては高い評価をすることができるんですけれども、他方で取得した株式を償却、キャンセルした会社が少ないです。実行株式が処分される、つまり市場にまた再放出される可能性がある状態なわけです。株主価値を希釈化するかもしれません。薄めてしまうかもしれません。投資家の目からすると好ましい状態ではないと思います。じゃあここでスライドのシェアを終えてください。これまで見てきましたように、ガバナンスは進展はしています。しかし、スピードは遅いですし、効果もあまり高くない。投資家の目線が取り入れられていない。ボード 3.0 への期待というのは、ここから始まっているように思います。ファンドから派遣されてきた力強い取締役がスピードを加速してくれる。投資家目線で大改革をしてくれるはずだ。このような期待は、素朴に納得感があるというか、うなずけるものがあります。そして実例を見ますと、日本でボード 3.0 を取り入れて株価が上がっている会社もあります。ただ、ボード 3.0 が機能する場合というのは限定的ではないでしょうか。私の個人的な意見ですけれども、これから申し上げるような条件が最低限必要になると思います。まず、CEO のストロングバイインがあること。つまり、現状を変革するんだという強い意志が CEO にまずあること。変革のために投資家目線を取り入れることが必要だと CEO 自身が考えていること。CEO の考える変革に要する機関とファンドの投資機関とが一致すること。指名委員会及び取締役会全体が CEO の変革プランを強く支持していること。ファンドの投資機関や投資の姿勢について透明性があって、多くの他の株主が賛同できること。こういうことが最低限必要になるだろうなというふうに思っています。また注意点もあろうかと思います。昨今強く求められる ESG 経営ですけれども、 これを実現するためには、多くのステークホルダーの利害調整が必要になります。ステークホルダーの中の一人であるシェアホルダー、しかもたくさんいるシェアホルダーのうちの特定の一人の利益を背後に抱えている取締役に特に期待を寄せるというのがボード 3.0 の考え方なんだろうと思います。この考え方は時代の逆行ではないかと懸念する人もいるんじゃないでしょうか。そしてこの懸念への対応が必要になるのではないでしょうか。以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much for those comments, Ichikawa-san. And I'd like to start off by asking a question of the group. And if Professor Gordon would like to respond, I would welcome that. I don't mean to put him on the spot, but I want to ask you, the panelists, if you could respond very briefly. Why do you think Professor Gordon's concept of Board 3.0, which, after all, is rooted rather specifically in the United States corporate history, why has it recently become such a popular topic of discussion in Japan, in the media, in academic, and specifically in the government? Why is this happening right now? I think I've discussed this with you, Hamaguchi-san, so maybe I'll invite you to respond first.
いや、正直言って、私はよくわかりません。なぜなのか。
Okay, that's a good answer. Ichikawa-san, do you have any views? Please go ahead.
はい、ありがとうございます。私も浜口さんと同じように最初わからなかったんですね。だけど、どんどん考えていくうちに、まあ結局、浜口さんご自身がおっしゃったところに原因があるんだと思います。コーポレートガバナンスコードが導入されて、形式上は、ガバナンスが進んだように見える。しかし、実質が伴っているかというと、まだちょっと足りない。ちょっとというか、だいぶ足りない。それを何とかしなければいけないというふうに強く考える人たちがいて、それはもしかしたら政府なのかもしれませんけれども、まあそういう何とかしなければいけないという思いから出てきた議論ではないかなというふうに考えています。ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Christina, do you have anything to add?
I don't want to be too harsh, but I think desperation, lack of a clear vision for the government, but everybody who's involved in corporate governance, there's a lack of a clear vision of the future. You know, what's wrong? What can we do? What's the vision? The ongoing top-down making of corporate governance policy, and what's the latest thing that we can make and impose on companies. And finally, when I talk to people, I think there's a real deep lack of understanding of what Board 3.0 really is, and that it's very much a US focused idea. And I don't think people who have read Professor Gordon's work deeply enough.
Yeah, Professor Gordon, this is one of the reasons I really wanted to let you lead off first, because I think, in fact, your work has been very misrepresented in Japan. And given what you've heard our panelists talk about, do you have any responses about what specifically a specific part of Board 3.0 which could work in Japan? If I can lead off with an example that I think is relevant, one of the problems I find in talking to Japanese boards is, in the case of large, old conglomerate companies, you have internal people who don't know much about their company. If they came up through a specific division, if they worked their whole career in a specific division, and the secretariat, which exists for the independent directors, of course, perhaps could be strengthened to help these people as well. I mean, you talk about the Strategic Review Committee and the individual 3.0 directors who would serve on public companies. Do you think that this is a suggestion for Japan to explore?
Well, I mean, I think I do know why it's being discussed. And
Please.
I mean, I think folks in the government and in the private sector are concerned about the performance of the domestic economy. I mean, the governance movement really got energized in the United States in the 1970s. There was a period of stagflation. Inflation was high, growth was low. The governance system, the way the firms were performing was poor. So I'm thinking about the automobile industry in the United States in the 70s. So in the immediate post-World War II period, the U.S. had a certain advantage because it had escaped many of the destruction of the economic base that had occurred in the course of the war. But eventually, U.S. firms found themselves outcompeted by firms all over the world, including those from Japan, right? I mean, so it was not just, I mean, the governance failure kind of doesn't exist in the air. It's that the firms are not performing well in a competitive economy, both domestically and in a global sense. So change is required, and this is the point of the lack of fit. If the board model doesn't help the firm adapt to the economic environment that exists, then change is needed. Whether Board 0.0 and all of its elements fits the scenario in Japan, about that I'm not sure. But the idea that there is a group of empowered directors, and by empowered, I mean basically to challenge the CEO, not just on strategy, but the execution of the strategy. That seems to me a critical element. And in the United States, that comes via the shareholder model and the activist investors, and maybe cross holdings, as Mr. Hamaguchi suggested, limit that in a certain way in Japan. But it could be that the governance code would require directors who have capacity to do this sort. So the whole idea is to have professionals who have incentives to really become thoroughly familiar with the firm and who are accountable in some outside way. I mean, that's part of it. And the reason to push in this direction is if you think firms are underperforming their inherent capacity, then you need to light a spark. And Board 3.0 offers that potential. The private equity model in the United States has produced very significant gains for many of the firms for which it's been applied. And so that was part of what gave us the notion of seeing whether elements of it could be ported over to the public firm in the United States. And in similar way, but not identically, if you have a governance model that is successful in some environment, then maybe you can figure out what pieces of it would fit the new environment. And so it's a transplant story, and you always need to figure out exactly how innovation, how reform can take root, of course, but certain elements of it, which is to have outsiders who thickly informed, well resourced and motivated, those are the critical elements. And so if you think that they can help the firms create value in Japan and help the economy grow faster, then that's the motivation why it might be on the agenda, on the agenda in Japan now.
Well, I think the two cases are similar in that, as Christina mentioned, I think that Japanese companies feel under duress. They need to globalize. Their domestic market is shrinking. The world is becoming more complicated. They have far more Western investors are demanding things of them, and they're trying to figure it out. I want to ask both you and the panelists, when it comes to having investors sit on boards in Japan, I think we started to see this in Japan only 3 years ago, and I'm aware of only 4 such examples. We have Scott Callan, the CIO of Ichigo. We have the 2 Value Act companies, Olympus and 7&I, and we have Mr. Nakagami, on whose board I sit, who is on the board of Marui. So I want to ask the Japanese participants whether, excuse me, Professor Ahmadjian and the other Tokyo-based panelists, how they see this working and whether they expect to see more of it. Clearly, we are seeing Toshiba nominate 2 activists to sit on their board. So I'd like to hear from the Tokyo-based people how they think this is working or how it will work in the future. But I'd like to ask Professor Gordon if you have any specific examples of where this has worked well in the United States for investors or PE investors to sit on the boards of publicly traded companies.
Oh yeah. I mean, a lot of activism is all about having directors, empower directors on boards, and you know, and their relational investors, the Tryon folks. I mean, that's part of the model isn't exact, except there's, I think the best part of the activist story precisely is to have empowered directors on boards who are committed to the firm. They make substantial investments for a long period of time, and their goal is a transformational one. It's not a quick buck story. So I think, you know, there are examples of that in the United States. And part of the point of the writing the 3.0 article is to make is to hold a mirror into a practice that has been used some, but could be more used by many more firms if they become self-aware that this is a goal.
So one of the points that you make is that the strategic, the board 3.0 director can deal with various types of shareholders. And I would like to ask the Tokyo-based people, this is sort of what's going on at Toshiba, right? I mean, this is the problem, is that you have various warring factions who seem to have different agendas, whether it's the institutional investors, the activists, the domestic mutual funds, and it seems that a solution is difficult to impossible to achieve because you don't have a kind of lead director or a powerful person on the board who is really effectively balancing or sorting out these differences or harmonizing them. What do you think, what do each of you think about the probability that inviting activists to sit on the board of Toshiba will be a helpful solution? I know this is a slightly controversial topic, but Hamaguchi-san, Ichikawa-san, Professor Ahmadjian, go ahead, Professor Ahmadjian.
Sorry, I'm going to not answer your question. I think I just want to remind you and everyone else that Toshiba is one situation, and it's not.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a situation that's out of control. So I'm a little concerned about using Toshiba as a model for many things. Point 2 is, do we really want a private equity model in Japan? And the results of private equity in the US are very, very mixed, and the social costs have been immense. And I'm a little concerned that we talk about, oh, the US and this and that, without really thinking, what do we need in Japan? What are the real implications of this? And then finally, there are different kinds of shareholders, and having an investor on a board who represents all kinds of investors is fine. But I see this as a little bit playing with dynamite, that we can learn elements of it. But boy, I do not want to see Japan going the direction of the United States.
So, I'm sorry, Ichikawa-san, Hamaguchi-san, do you have anything to add to this comment about activists joining corporate boards? Okay. we can move on to the next question then, which is about how do independent directors, who do you guys work for, right? Because there are many shareholders, and there's allegiance shareholders, and there's real investors, and there's long-term investors, and there's short-term investors, and Mr. Hokugo of Pension Fund Association raises the point about how do you decide whether you're working for the management or stakeholders or shareholders? How do you know? And how do you identify the constituency in the particular situation where you are that you need to represent? And in the case of companies which Hamaguchi-san speaks about so eloquently, where there are this sort of majority of allegiance shareholders, how do you look to the real investors to support you when you're making these decisions? And finally, in the era of ESG, and I bet Ichikawa-san has something to say about this, if the concerns of ESG and the stakeholders might theoretically come into contrast with the interests of the management or the other investors. For example, recently we've had a lot of investors asking for the CEO or senior managers to be fired. And we've seen that happen 4 times in the last 4 years. And now you have this case with Oasis and Fujitec, who is inviting people to vote against the president of Fujitec. And that's now been approved or sort of endorsed by ISS and Glass Lewis. How do you balance all these, and how do you figure out who you're working for? Can I ask Ichikawa-san to lead off on that?
はい、市川です。一言で申し上げますと、投資家からもう直接的に叱咤激励が欲しいと思います。独立取締役とすると。で、信じられないかもしれないですけれども、独立取締役は株主のために、働いているつもりで私たちはいます。で、だけど、何をどこまでこだわるべきなのか、何をするべきか、どこまでこだわるべきなのかということになると、独立取締役の一人一人によってイメージ違うと思います。また、独立取締役が提案して意味があるかどうかというのは、それぞれの会社の抱えている課題、状況によって違うんですよね。ですので、その会社の状況をちゃんと分析して分かっている投資家から、対話してもらって、直接話をすることにより、独立取締役が、本当に投資家、株主のために働いているのかというのをチェックしてもらいたいなっていうふうに思っています。それが独立取締役が有効に活動するための強いサポートになります。以上です。
Great. I've done a very poor job here because I'm being told that we have only 1 more minute remaining for Q&A. So if I can do like whatever that's called, a rapid fire thing. Could I ask each of you, I think I flagged this question to you in advance, so I hope you've been thinking about it. What is, the key thing that you can think of to improve the functioning of boards in Japan? Hamaguchi-san, can I ask you to give us 1 sentence or 2 sentences?
最初に申し上げましたけども、マーケットは機能して、初めてそのボードも機能するということだと私はいつも思ってます。したがって、まず市場の機能を、特に日本の場合にはですね、安定株主構造を何とかして、市場の機能をまず回復させる。それが一番だと思います。
Thank you very much. How about Professor Ahmadjian?
Selection of truly diverse independent directors who are committed to long-term improvement of company value, who are willing to speak up and engage and fire the CEO if necessary. And I also say CEO attitudes are very, very important.
Yeah, I think you've made this point many times, and I'm sorry we didn't get time to discuss it. I had wanted to ask Ichikawa-san, about the different legal models of Japanese companies. Does it matter, or is it just a case of the CEO having the right attitude? And I think I would agree with you, Christina. Ichikawa-san, do you have anything to add? Like, what is the most important thing that could happen to improve the board functioning in Japan?
そうですね。時間も足りませんので、一言、コーポレートガバナンスの、向上、さらなる向上という意味では、私は、みんなのコーポレートガバナンスという議論はもう終わりにして、個々の会社の置かれた状況、課題に応じたガバナンスを語っていく時代ではないかなと思います。そのために、それを背景に、投資家と取締役が、対話をしていくこと、これが重要ではないかなと思っています。ありがとうございます。
Yeah, that is a very key point and something that doesn't happen enough now, as I've heard from many independent directors. In conclusion, I just want to make the point, and it ties into one. We have so many great questions in the Q&A that we couldn't get to, but in a strange way, I think that Japan may head down the path of Board 3.0 even faster than America, because there are, as you all know, there's many listed companies in Tokyo who are expected to choose MBOs or other forms of privatization because they cannot or will not comply with the new governance and disclosure requirements of the TSC Prime section. There are hundreds of companies in this category. So the effect of a mass privatization or a mass MBO market may see the resurgence of a Board 3.0 in Japan even faster than it's going to happen in America. So it just remains for me to thank all of the speakers. It was such a broad, gigantic topic. I'm so sorry we couldn't have another hour to talk about it and answer all the excellent questions in the Q&A box. But I think it's time for me to hand it over to the director of CJEB, David Weinstein, to make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Alicia. I'm, as Alicia mentioned, I'm the director of CJEB and the Carla S. Schaut Professor of the Japanese Economy at Columbia. And I just want to say on behalf of everyone at CJEB, I want to just thank you all for joining us today and on the previous 3 days of our Tokyo conference. This has just been a tremendous set of distinguished speakers over all of the days, and today was no exception to that. I want to thank all of our speakers for their time and engaging remarks on topics ranging from we started off with Japanese diplomacy to diversity and inclusion to economic security, and today on board relations in Japan and the United States. If you missed any of our conference days, I encourage you to check our website in a few weeks for the full report on all the events. We also plan to post recordings of the 4 days. I also want to take a moment to thank our corporate and individual sponsors for all of their support, as the Center's activities and long tradition of leading the research on Japanese economics and business are dependent on their generous funding. I really hope that you will be able to, that we will be able to hold our annual Tokyo conference in person next year in Tokyo. And that you can join us then and celebrate with us. Until then, good night from New York and have a wonderful day in Japan. Thank you again, and please take care.